Hi, my name's Chris Thomas, and welcome to the first DVD in our new series on the fundamentals of modeling in 3ds Max. Modeling is probably one of the first things that a new user will do when they first use a 3D program such as 3ds Max, Maya, and so on. After all, it's a pretty basic need. If you don't have a model, then you don't really have anything to render or animate with in most cases. So without a model, you don't really have a scene to work with. So in most cases, most people will firstly want to model something in 3D before they go on to other areas like animation and lighting and so on. Now, before we start, let me quickly give you an idea of where you need to be at with 3ds Max at this point to get the most out of this DVD. Firstly, you need to know how to navigate around inside 3ds Max. What I'm talking about here is being able to rotate the viewport around, pan around the viewport, grab an object such as this, know how to move it around in 3 dimensions, and so on and so forth. Be able to zoom in on objects. Just very, very basic stuff like that. This is the equivalent of, in the real world, being able to just pick up an object and move around it, look at it from different angles, and to be able to focus in on it and move it around in your hands, move it from one place to another place. So it's the 3D equivalent of actually interacting with your object. It's pretty basic stuff. So if you need to do so, please view our Workflow Fundamentals DVD or the 3ds Max online manual to get your general navigation skills up to speed before you go onwards with this tutorial. We'll be basing this series on 3ds Max 7.0. The reason for this is that release, version 7, was the last release in which major new features were added to the 3ds Max modeling toolset, or in toolsets that were actually heavily used in modeling. Don't get me wrong, new features have been added to the modeling toolset in releases since version 7, obviously, but in my opinion, they're not so great that they demand that we produce this series in one of those newer releases. And I've kept back from using the latest release, not because I want to, lose Autodesk money. Obviously not. Version 8 and version 9 are great pieces of software. But if I did use version 8, then everybody who used version 7 wouldn't be able to use the example files that come with this DVD, and the same goes for version 9. So I've used the last viable version of 3ds Max that, in my opinion, had pretty much 99% of the modeling features that you will find in the latest release. So if you use version 7, you'll find pretty much everything in version 7 in terms of modeling that you have in version 9. Obviously, there are new features, and if you're an advanced modeler, you may find there are features in version 8 and version 9 which are absolutely essential for you. But as we're learning to model in 3ds Max, version 7 pretty much has everything that we need. And as I said, if you're a user of version 7, 8, or 9, you'll be able to load up any of the example files that come with this series. So I think it's a pretty good trade off. Now, it's important to bear in mind that the aim of this DVD series is to get you up to speed with the very basics of primitive and poly modeling, spline modeling, and sub D modeling. In this DVD, we're looking at getting you up to speed in terms of navigating around the viewport and being comfortable with moving around and using objects in 3ds Max. And we'll be building our models purely out of primitives and modifying them to some extent using modifiers and space warps. Now, I'm not aiming with this series to get you up to any kind of mastery of modeling. This is an introduction to modeling in 3ds Max, after all. It's a fundamental level DVD. What I'm going to try and do in this DVD, as I said, is show you how primitives can be used to build a model on a very basic level, and then how to make minor modifications to those primitives using modifiers and space warps. And then in the second DVD in the series, we'll be looking at mesh editing and how we can use that to take those primitives further and refine them, and also how to build objects completely basically by using mesh editing as a tool in itself. And then in the third DVD in the series, we'll be moving on to quite a different subject in a way, which is spline modeling, where we'll be using curves to define meshes, and that gives us a whole different set of tools that we can use to produce elements of our model. Then in the fourth DVD in the series, we'll be looking at subdivision modeling, which is basically a subset of poly modeling. And we'll be using that to create certain elements of our model that make sense to be made out of sub-Ds. And that's the case of each DVD in the series. In DVD 1, we'll be building elements out of primitives. DVD 2, we'll be building elements of our
little project from meshes and doing mesh editing. DVD3 will build parts of the model out of spline objects, things that make sense with splines. And then in DVD4, we'll be finishing off the model using sub-Ds, and we'll be combining all of the techniques together in DVD4. And this is very important, because when you're modeling, you don't use any one of the skills that the 4 DVDs in this series. You don't use those skills in isolation. You use them all together interchangeably.
You will want to be able to mix it up. And, if you're going to be a modeler and you're going to work in different fields, it really helps if you know all the different aspects of modeling that you can use in 3ds Max. If you're only going to work in architecture, then you're probably going to use spline modeling very heavily and some poly modeling. Not so much sub-D modeling, but it's always useful to know sub-D modeling if you do need it. And the same goes for if you're a character modeler. Most character modelers these days will spend 95% of their time using sub-D tools. But every now and again, you're going to want to create objects to combine with your character, which really are better off being made with splines or just by basic poly modeling. So it's a good idea to have a broad basis in all areas of modeling so that you can use the tools that you need for the job at any one moment in time. During my career, I've used all of the modeling techniques in this series to produce models for commercial clients such as the BBC, the Discovery Channel, and Sesame Workshop, and so on. And those models were as diverse as architectural models of a hotel in Cairo, a highly detailed Hudson steam train, alien planetscapes, animatable props for use by animators, cartoon characters, and the Great Pyramids of Giza. And that may seem like a simple thing, modeling just a pyramid, but this was the Great Pyramid of Giza as it was being constructed. So it's millions of blocks and buildings and ramps and so on and so forth. You name it, I've probably had a go at modeling it at some point in the past. And one thing I have learned from these projects is that having the widest possible tool set to hand will give you the most options whilst working on a project. Sometimes spline modeling is ideal, other times hand creating polys is what you really need. Whilst on other occasions, painting a mesh using one of the newer modeling packages like, say, ZBrush or Mudbox, that would be the only way forward. Now, we're not going to be looking at those tools in this series. That's more of a sort of an advanced modeling tool set. But I just want to make it, very clear to you that don't get hung up on any one area of modeling. It's really a good idea to learn all the different areas and then have those available to you in your tool set. So in this series, I want to get you on the road to modeling, show you the various methods that are available to you, and get you to a point where you'll be able to look at an element of a model and know with ease what that, say, a spline or a poly model approach is ideal for that item, and also how to go about using that tool set. You won't be an experienced modeler at the end of the series, and if you're new to the field, that just needs to, come from hours and hours of practice to be put in by you. I can't teach advanced skills at this stage. You're going to have to work your way towards that. And obviously modeling training DVDs like this one will get you partly along the way, but you also have to put in the hours to learn how to model in 3D. It's very much a physical kind of skill, just like sculpting in the real world. So you have to become more dexterous in 3D, and that only comes again with practice. Modeling it's not an easy field, but it is rewarding, and you do have something tangible to use at the end of it. If you work in some areas of 3D like scripting, at the end of the day, you'll have a tool that only some people will use. But when you're modeling something, at the end of the day, you'll have a very real product in front of you. You'll have built a table, or you'll have made a landscape, or you'll have created part of a character. And at the end of the week, you may have completed the entire character. So that it's a very rewarding subject in that you get immediate feedback from what you've actually done in any one particular modeling session. So with that out of the way, most of us will need to model an object at some point within our day-to-day use of 3ds Max. And this series of DVDs aims to give you a fundamental skill level with modeling in 3ds Max, just the skills that you need to do that task. During this series, we'll be looking at 4 main methods for modeling in 3ds Max. Those methods are primitive modeling, polygonal modeling, spline modeling, and finally, but not least, sub-D modeling. In a way, all of these methods are unified in that they're just really different interfaces to modeling with polygons in one way or another. Each method offers us certain advantages such as simplicity, speed, flexibility, or suitability to organic or mechanical and technical modeling. I think it's important that you have at least a basic working understanding of each of these areas, as they will all probably come in useful to you at some point in the future. What we won't be looking at in any great detail in these DVDs are spline patch based modeling and NURBS. Both of these methods are totally viable in their own right, but for one reason or another, neither of these systems is in mainstream use in 3ds Max these days, at least with the tools that come with the actual core package. Patch primitives have been a standard feature of 3ds Max since its initial release in 1996. Until roughly 2001, they were popular for modeling smooth mechanical surfaces like car bodywork and, in some cases, characters, and also for organic models such as flora and fauna. The main reasons that patch based modeling has been superseded by polygonal subdivision modeling is because of SubD's ease of use and also its greater flexibility. Currently, this holds true both for film and game modeling markets. So, quite simply, most organic modelers only work using SubD techniques these days, as that's what's required by their employers' production pipelines. If you want to, you can go and learn the patch modeling system and you can use it yourself. But you may find that if you work in a game studio or at a film studio or TV studio, they will want you to model using SubDs, and therefore you may have a tool set that doesn't really fit into their pipeline. And I'll be honest with you, there are very few advantages in using patch models these days, because effectively when you work with SubDs, you're working with a kind of patch based system anyway. That's the idea of it. It kind of replaces patch models. So that's why we're not really going to be looking at patches so much in this series. And for NURBS, the reason is maybe a little less obvious. 3ds Max does indeed have a NURBS based geometry class, but it was bought in from a third-party vendor some years ago, and the library on which the NURBS system was built was found to be quite slow and cumbersome to work with. So there are NURBS curves and NURBS surfaces in 3ds Max, but they've been found to be impractical for character use, as they're hard to rig with and have very poor interactive performance. Once again, for organic character modeling, SubDs have proven to be the way, as they offer very good interactive performance in conjunction with being the favoured modeling method at the moment. So in 3ds Max, primitive, polymodeling, splines, and SubDs are the current core modeling toolset, and that's where we'll be concentrating in this series of DVDs. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not writing NURBS off as a general modeling toolset, and if you are interested in NURBS modeling, and it's well worth learning if you're mainly interested in creating technical models, things like phones, cars, engines, architecture, and so on, then I'd highly recommend checking out PowerNURBS from nPower Software. This is a plugin for 3ds Max that offers a very comprehensive, fast, and stable NURBS toolset that will allow you to create your own NURBS models and also import them from other NURBS using packages out there. It's currently very, very highly regarded by its customers and is worth evaluating if your needs lie in that direction. So anyway, let's get back to this DVD. In this first DVD, we'll be looking at the basic element in all of the modeling systems in this series, and that is the polygon. Polygons are pretty much the universal modeling media in all current 3D applications. If you're working in 3ds Max, Maya, XSI, Houdini, or pretty much any other package, a good polygon modeling skill set is pretty much essential. And once you have learned how to model with polygons in one application, those skills can be ported over to another application relatively easily. Another thing of note is that currently polygons are used by all of the rendering systems out there. So even with primitives, NURBS, spline patches, or with the spline-based surfaces you get from Extrude, Lathe, and the Loft compound objects in 3ds Max, you're always going to end up with your surfaces being tessellated into a polygonal mesh when they are rendered. When polygon modeling, you will not want to build very basic forms from scratch on every single occasion. And by basic forms, I mean cubes, cones, tubes, cylinders, planes, toroids, and so on. The kind of objects that you can actually see in front of you here. These are all basic shapes that turn up in so many objects in the real world, or are there in a slightly distorted form. So on this DVD, we'll also be looking at using 3ds Max's model primitives to get your ball rolling in creating your models. And all of these objects that you can see in front of you here in the viewport are 3ds Max primitives.
So throughout the series, we're going to be using a a core project, a unified project that will take from DVD to DVD to teach the tools that we're learning in that particular DVD. So in this DVD, we'll be using primitives to build elements of our model. And it's a go-kart, and you can see here that I've actually got a number of primitives which are being used as a guide for the frame, which we'll actually be looking at in DVD 2 in the series, where we look at mesh editing. So if I just click on this layer here, you can actually see the frame itself. And this is one piece of geometry, just one mesh, and that was created using mesh editing. It's a relatively simple mesh, but I didn't want to make it too complicated. Obviously, at this level, we're just learning the fundamentals. So at this stage, I just wanted to show you how to, the basic kind of workflow to actually make the frame. Yeah, and as I said, that will follow in DVD 2. But in this DVD, what we're actually looking at are other elements of the go-kart. We're looking at some of the steering mechanism, the actual steering column down here. Then you have a little lever here that pushes an arm along here. That actually then pushes this arm here, and then that makes the wheels rotate. You can see that the actual wheels themselves are missing at the moment, and that's because we'll be making those in DVD 3, where we're working with splines. And other elements of the kart that actually make sense using spline tools will be built in that DVD using those tools. Things like the steering wheel, the wheels, other elements, maybe the engine cover, and maybe some pipes as well. So various bits and bobs will be created in DVD 3 in the series using splines. And then in DVD 4, we'll return to the go-kart once more, and we'll build certain elements of it out of sub-Ds. Maybe the seat, that's a very curvilinear shape. Now, in the original design that I based this on, the actual seat was a right angle kind of piece of wood. But I think we'll build something which looks a little bit more sophisticated. And maybe also we'll add some embellishments to the go-kart. Maybe some wheel covers to stop mud getting splattered onto the driver. And some other elements like that. Free-form elements that will work best if they're modeled from sub-Ds. So this is going to be our project. And as I said, we're going to use this to learn all of the different tools throughout this series. Before we move on and start looking at primitives, modifiers, and so on in this DVD, let's quickly run through all the chapters and see what we'll be tackling and the order that we'll be tackling those subjects in. So in chapter 1, we'll be looking at efficient scene navigation. And as I said earlier on in this introduction, really you should be at the point where you can navigate around your scene. But just to make sure that you can actually get the most out of this DVD, I'll very quickly run through the main areas that you need to know about basically in navigating around your scene, moving objects, and interacting with your models. You really do need to know this before you can actually model. Otherwise, effectively, you're basically handicapped. You can't actually interact with your models and interact with your scene efficiently. So I thought it was important that we cover that. Then in chapter 2, we look at keyboard shortcuts and other interface features. By interface features, I mean little tips to allow you to work with the interface more quickly, how to use spinners in the best way, how to abort moving something, rotating something, little things like that. And then in chapter 3, we'll be moving on to our first sort of real chapter where we're looking at what actually polygons are. What is it that we're dealing with in 3ds Max when we're modeling with polygons? Basically everything in pretty much every 3D package out there is built out of polygons. So I thought, it's very important that we have a very clear and concise understanding of exactly what a polygon is, what is it that makes it, and why is it such a useful item to actually make models out of? What's so special about the polygon? So we'll be looking at that in chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, we'll be looking at 2 polygonal mesh types, because 3ds Max has 2 different types. One is called the editable mesh, and this was present in 3ds Max when it was launched back in 1996. And then later, a few years later, Autodesk introduced a new type of mesh called the editable polygon. And that was because it was found that subdivision modeling was becoming very popular, and that the structure of the editable mesh really wasn't suitable for working with sub-Ds. So they introduced the editable polygon. And we'll be looking at the differences between those 2 mesh systems in that chapter. Then we'll be moving on and we'll be looking at primitives, and how a primitive is a kind of template for making very basic objects that we see around us in the real world. Things like tubes, cylinders, spheres, cubes, things like that. And you'll find in pretty much any 3D package out there, you have these primitives. Max has a very extensive set of primitives. It has standard primitives and extended primitives. And you'll even find primitives for windows, a teapot, spheres, things like a Gengon, which is quite a strange shape. You can check that out for yourself. And we'll be looking at what those primitives are and how they become tessellated. So we end up with a polygon mesh that we can actually work with in the viewport and we can actually model with. Then we'll be moving on to looking at coordinate systems, which are very important for when you're modeling. This is one of those things that, I could really assume that you know about, but again, it's really key when you're modeling that you have a good understanding what the coordinate systems are and how each one relates to your model, what the world coordinate system is, what local coordinate system is, what the parent space is, things like that. So we'll be looking at that in that chapter. Then we'll be moving on to look at the home grid, which is the basic grid. It's basically this kind of visual representation of the world space. And again, it's very important that you understand how that works, how when you model things, they automatically appear on the home grid, and then how you can use the snap system to actually work with a home grid to define objects in a much more precise manner than just, blindly just drawing objects out into the viewport. With snaps, you can actually very precisely draw objects based on the home grid. Then we'll be moving on to looking at pivots, and those kind of work together hand in hand with the coordinate systems and the home grids and everything else. So yet again, a very key concept. I just wanted to make sure that you have a very good understanding what the pivot is, what it represents, how you can actually change the pivot, because you can actually modify the pivot. And also we look at custom grids in this chapter also, which allow us to create our own, as it were, home grid, which we can build objects on. We can change those at will, and we can have multiple custom grids. So it's a very flexible feature in 3ds Max, and something which is worth looking at for certain modeling projects. Then we'll move on to look at modifiers and the stack. Again, a very key subject, something which is unique to 3ds Max. In Maya, you have a node-based system. In Houdini, you have a very, very node-based system, which makes basically every modeling action that you take is based on a node. But in 3ds Max, we have a linear stack-based system, which is very powerful and also quite easy to understand, I think. It's actually easier to understand how those modifications take place in a linear manner than maybe in the kind of node-based systems that you see in Maya, and especially so in something like Houdini. Then in the next chapter, we'll be looking at space warps, which is another kind of modification system, similar to modifiers. And I'll be explaining the difference between modifiers and space warps in those two chapters, so I won't dwell on what those differences are at this point. You'll find out very clearly in those two chapters. And then we'll move on to pretty much the end section of our DVD. And this is where we'll actually look at creating some of those elements in the Go card based on the primitives that I've already placed there as a guide. We'll be going in and replacing those simple primitives, which basically, you could say they're fine, but in this case, I want to make them a little bit better, put in some bevels, enhance them in certain ways. And we'll be looking at bending some of those primitives in the second chapter in this section. And we'll also then, in the last chapter, take that basic principle of using a modifier to bend an object, and we'll bend it twice to create a U-shape. And I'll show you how you can actually create that U-shape in two different ways using the same modifier. That's one of the really cool things about 3ds Max is the range of modifiers is large. You can do a lot with them, and it's very freeform in how you can use them. You can use two modifiers in a different way, and I might meet somebody and watch them modeling using a modifier and find out that they're using it in a completely different way to the way I would actually model. So we'll be looking at, some uses of a bend modifier in those three chapters in conjunction with primitives. Let's make a start on this DVD, and we'll start off by me showing you some efficient scene navigation methods within 3ds Max, the basics of how you navigate around the viewport. Let's have a look at that now.